how the people are doing. So, man, I've been waiting 2 whole months to say those words. It's been a while, been quite a while. Well, let's just say this: trying to search for a job and finishing your thesis at the same time, it's not exactly a cakewalk, not in the slightest. Barely had time to breathe. But all that has been taken care of in a neat little bow. I got everything I wanted, to say the least. And more than anything, weirdly enough, I managed to do a fashion show in the middle of all this. So yeah, that's kind of the reason why I didn't even bother to cover the iPhone, because iPhones don't really do that well on my channel at least. And secondly, I didn't have time, to say the least. So buying an expensive ass iPhone and then not covering it just didn't seem financially wise. So yeah, with that said, let's jump in, because the Oppo Find X9 Pro, is an interesting device, to say the least. I've quite a few hopes, quite a few expectations, and let's see if it can fulfill those. Alright then, as per usual, we are starting off with the color profiles. Now, these are the original regular color profiles that you could hope for. I think there's something very interesting going on. So, on one hand, we have the Oppo, which is going for a very natural look, unexpectedly natural. Now, obviously, how close it is to proper natural colors, well, we can really understand that from a Vivo comparison, which is coming up, obviously. But compared to the Huawei, which does not care about natural colors in the slightest, I mean, just look at this shot. It is processed, unapologetic, it is high contrast. I do like the high contrast, but the colors are not to my taste. But of course, what if you want high contrast with the Oppo? Maybe you want the similar colors, but also you want that contrast. Well, you can get kind of close with this particular preset. I'll be honest, I don't exactly remember the exact name of this preset, but I mean, you're seeing this on the screen right now, so it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, I do think that this can be utilized. Now, there is a third preset available on both phones, and they basically exchange places in terms of how the contrast and colors look, because if you go for the bright look on the Huawei, well, then it kind of just washes out the image quite a bit. But also, I do think the natural colors kind of are brought forth. Not entirely natural, but they do look better and less processed than before. The Oppo, on the other hand, it goes crazy. That's the best way to put it. Now, obviously, there is going to be a time and place for using these presets. Like in this particular case, it looks nice on both without question, but we could go for high contrast on both. And I can definitively say that a higher contrast look that we can have on both phones, it just looks better in this case. Like, the way the lighting was, the way the scene looked, the higher contrast just looks nicer. And I would say the Oppo is looking better than the Huawei in this particular case, specifically because the highlights are being handled a little bit better. The overall exposure is just lower, so it looks more professional. Now look, for the sake of this comparison, I'm basically going to leave everything on default, so we don't have any color presets going on here. These are just the regular colors that you're going to expect when you're using photo mode. And the idea is that we're going to test out against multiple smartphones and see how well it works under different circumstances with these color profiles. Like, it worked really well in this case. It may not be the case in other comparisons, which will come out very soon in the future. But of course, you would have noticed already, the Oppo goes for something very interesting: adaptive high resolution. It's a very basic option you can just turn on in the settings, and it just switches between 12 megapixels, 25 megapixels, and 50 megapixels depending on how much light you have in your scene. So when we have a good amount of sunlight, we're getting 25 and 50 megapixel shots across the board. If the light goes down, then it dynamically switches down to 12 megapixels to get cleaner images. And by far, across this entire comparison, it has worked basically flawlessly. At least as compared to the Huawei, I've not seen any degradation in quality, any degradation in processing or HDR or anything like that. Now, the detail preservation side of things, we'll get to it. Of course, I know the 25 and 12 pixel thing already exists even in iPhones, but between 25, 12 and also 50, now that, as far as I can remember, Oppo may just be the only one that I've used so far. Now obviously, I had to check out the details. I didn't even realize that Oppo was doing this until much later when I saw the resolutions on these photos, which is why the framing on this one isn't perfect, but it is close enough that we can maybe check out the details on both. I would say this may not be the result you're expecting, but do bear in mind, and I'm sure you can see this, Huawei's sharpening. It loves sharpening. That's the best way to put it. It goes absolutely crazy. Now, the funny thing is, the Oppo doesn't like to sharpen at all, which is why this shot, even with high resolution, doesn't really look like there's a whole lot of detail just popping out like we see with the Huawei. It is oversharpened, it is overprocessed on the Huawei, but I do think that basically we could use a little bit of sharpening on the Oppo and it would go a long way. The Huawei could just get rid of sharpening altogether because that is not helping the case here. So dynamic high resolution, is it a cool thing to have? Yes. Does it really give you a whole bunch of benefits? Perhaps not as much as I would have personally expected or preferred to have, but it's a starting point. All Oppo needs to do is literally add a pinch of sharpening in there and it'll probably turn out exceptional because you do have the resolution to play with. Now, as you would have expected at this point, HDR is never going to be an issue. Like, these are flagship smartphones and they don't suffer when it comes to HDR. It works flawlessly, as you can probably tell. Now, the approach with the colors and the contrast is very different. In a lot of these shots, Oppo is not trying to boost shadows nearly as much. It does have a very nice and natural look and feel, like the highlight roll-off, the way the colors are handled, the way the saturation is kept really nicely under control and not just boosted all the way like we see on the Huawei. Now, of course, the Huawei never claims, neither tries to go for natural colors, but I would like to have the option because not everyone wants really boosted, really vibrant, really processed colors. Now, case in point with this one right here. I don't like how the Huawei looks. It has nice contrast, but those colors are just way too saturated. It looks way too unnatural for my personal taste. I much rather prefer what we have on the Oppo. So yeah, my personal preference is right there. Choose whichever one you want. However, what if we crop into 500%? Because this is once again a high-res image. So here's the deal. I was basically standing 6 inches from my monitor and I noticed, literally in the pixels, that the Oppo has way less sharpening, very similar amount of detail, but when you look at it from afar, maybe when you're looking at it on your smartphone, on YouTube, then actually the Huawei looks sharper because of the way the contrast is handled, because of the way the sharpening is handled. Now, is that preferable, or is it better to have a good image from the Oppo which has no sharpening but very similar level of detail that has been confirmed by yours truly? I don't know, honestly. This is quite an interesting situation we have here. Now, outside of that very minor difference, I would say that we have a very similar situation as we saw with the main cameras. We have much more saturation, much more vibrant but also unnatural colors on the Huawei, as opposed to the exact opposite on the Oppo. Now, when it comes to HDR shots, of course, the Oppo is the one that doesn't go for too much lifting of the shadows and it doesn't go for too much processing, which can be nice, but well, if you do prefer how the Huawei looks, well, then knock yourself out. That's the best way to put it. Now, when it comes to macro photography, so both phones can do telephoto macro, which, thank the Lord, that is exactly how things should be. Macro photography should be with the telephoto cameras. It is just straight up better. And I can tell you this, in this particular case, when it comes to macro photography, I do think the Huawei can not just get in closer, but because of the way it handles contrast and it handles colors, the way it doesn't go for a really natural look, I think it actually looks nicer on the Huawei. With the contrast, it just looks really nice and punchy. You want style. That's why you take macro photos. So for this particular use case, I do prefer Huawei. Now, obviously, there's still a whole lot more to unpack. I'm speaking, of course, about zoom. So we are starting off with 2x sensor crop on both phones. Now, these are under medium lighting conditions because with just how good these phones are getting, differences are much more prominent. So cropping all the way in, I think it's very obvious that the Huawei is smoothing things out a little too much. Now, we do get a little bit of grain on the Oppo, definitely, but the overall look of the image is much nicer. The overall detail preservation is definitely higher with 2x sensor crop, oddly enough, as opposed to what we're getting on the Huawei, which is surprising because the regular 1x shot in good lighting wasn't really all that impressive on the Oppo, but the 2x sensor crop somehow is. And trust me, there's a whole lot more surprises in store for you. So let's move on to 3x, or rather 3.7x on the Huawei. And of course, cropping all the way into 500%. Well, of course, there's going to be a bit of a framing difference because 3.7x on the Huawei versus 3x on the Oppo. But interestingly enough, as you can probably very clearly tell, the Oppo is way better as opposed to the Huawei. Like, the sheer amount of detail and the lack of overprocessing, over sharpening that we're getting on the Oppo, exceptional. It looks perfect. This is exactly what I would expect from a really nice high quality telephoto sensor. And we do have a really nice high quality telephoto sensor on both I think it's even bigger on the Huawei, but somehow the processing is not really able to keep up. But then of course, Oppo, even in the camera app, they love flaunting the fact that they have a 6x via a sensor crop on top of the 3x telephoto. We already saw that the telephoto is good, and I'm guessing that the 6x would be somewhat similar. Well, not entirely, because look, I'm not entirely sure if this is because of slightly less than ideal lighting on the Oppo, but at the end of the day, the 6x sensor crop is not producing nearly as nice detail or as good results in general as opposed to what we saw with the 3x. The regular 3x shot looks so much nicer as opposed to Huawei, but somehow it's 6x is basically the same, if not actually better, on the Huawei. Crazy as that sounds. But wait, there's more. Because now we are looking at 10x. Now 10x, actually, Huawei has a bit of an optical advantage. So the way it works on the Huawei is that we have something called a hybrid optical zoom, wherein the prism for the periscope zoom with a 3.7x, it literally moves to a different lens structure that allows us to get somewhere around the 9 to 10x range of hybrid optical zoom, because there is a bit of a sensor crop involved in here as well. It's a whole situation. It's the best way to put it. So with a hybrid optical zoom at 10x, which is quite a bit, will the Huawei have an advantage? It is slightly better. It has less sharpening, less haloing around the edges, a bit at least. But I mean, I don't know. I don't really see the benefit of having a prism structure, all that engineering to have a prism that moves literally from one lens structure to another just so we can get this, which Oppo is doing that with the 3x. Yes, it's a very high quality, very nice 200 megapixel 3x, and we'll get to high-res in a second, but I don't see the genuine benefit here. Maybe it's optical after all, so maybe low light, perhaps. We have one for that as well. Now last but not least, we have 30x. Now the reason I like to go for 30x in general is because a lot of phones can handle 10x fairly well, like the Oppo, case in point. Even with the 3x, is able to handle 10x, which is a huge digital crop, quite nicely, but 30x, well, it still handles itself better than the Huawei at least, which I still don't get it. Like, it has a hybrid optical zoom. The whole point is to give us that optical advantage, which I'm just not seeing the advantage here. Is Oppo's processing really that much better? Sounds kind of crazy, but may just be the case. Who knows? Now next up, of course, we have high resolution. So I think we can handily give the zoom section to Oppo, mainly because it doesn't have any fancy machinations going on behind the scenes. It just has a really nice sensor at the 3x. Processing just takes over after that, and it handles itself tremendously. However, with high resolution, things are not quite the same. So as we saw in regular 12 pixel shots, Huawei can over sharpen quite a bit. Its over processing is very predominant, but with 50 megapixels, things get a lot more interesting, because now, I think because of the high resolution, the over sharpening is much more under control, or it at least doesn't seem as obvious. There is sharpening, I can tell you there's sharpening. The Oppo, as you would expect, does no sharpening at all. It really does nail that natural look and feel. But as I said previously, you could always use just a pinch of sharpening to really bring out details, especially when you have high enough resolution to play with. And that's exactly what the Huawei is doing. It's definitely going quite a bit, but I do think at high res, the sharpening works in the favor of the Huawei, as opposed to when in 12 pixels, it really just makes the image look worse. Now of course, that fact is very true when it comes to the main camera, but what about the ultrawide camera? We all know and very clearly understand that ultrawide cameras in most cases are not nearly as good or as high quality as the main camera. So I would presume, because of that neither of these are doing a particularly tremendous job. Both phones look kind of overprocessed, a little too smoothened out, and there's still a bit of sharpening and haloing on the Oppo, but on the other hand, the Huawei, it just looks awkward, to say the least. Like, that sharpening is not helping it out in the slightest. So yeah, not the best one from either of these. Now of course, we have the telephoto cameras. So there's two things about the Huawei that are annoying, to say the least. Well, one thing that is just plain infuriating, which I'll show you in just a second, and the second thing, which is just awkward, is that we can't use the 9.4x or the 10x for high resolution, because I'm guessing it's because of the sensor crop that it does, that you just don't have access to high resolution in general. So you're stuck with 3.7x specifically if you want high res. So that's something. But a much bigger problem on the Huawei is this right here. So you can see this motion blur happening on the Huawei, right? While on the Oppo, it is a bit sharpened, which is odd because I thought Oppo's whole thing was not sharpening things, but I guess that is selective to say the least. However, it is much nicer simply because it has no motion blur, and also 50 megapixel detail preservation is quite nice. Honestly speaking, it is the most ridiculous and unnatural defect. That's the best way to put it. It is definitely a defect on the Huawei. No smartphone in 2025 should require a long exposure just to take high res shots. This is not night mode, it's high res. There's no need for long exposure. Mainly because the Oppo is right here taking 200 megapixel shots without any shutter lag, without any long exposure, and it's doing it fairly well. I mean, it's not the biggest difference. I would suggest you stick to 50 megapixels if you go for the Oppo, because there's not really enough of a difference to use 200, but hey, it looks good regardless, and there's a guarantee of no motion blur. Now finally we have got night mode, and yes, before anyone rants in the comments, I know human subjects are not in this particular comparison. This is specifically rear camera photography, regular rear camera photography. Human subjects will be tackled separately, mainly because at this point you would have realized this is a huge video and there's a lot of details that we like to cover. So having human subjects separate just allows me to cover that much more. Anyways, getting back to the night mode, I think it's plenty obvious that there is a whole lot of contrast happening on the Huawei, and it's not nearly as high on the Oppo. Oppo does go for a more natural look. Across the board, we have seen that the color profile, the regular color profile on the Oppo, that's what it's all about. Now, I do intend to test out the high contrast profiles as well on the Oppo, and I just want to see if that can be normally utilized or not. Well, we'll see soon enough. But the regular color profile, you can expect regular amounts of contrast, fairly nice and natural looking colors, but that's not the case on the Huawei. Now sometimes it can look nice, depending on how much light you have, depending on what kind of colors you have in your scene. Well, the Huawei can look quite nice, but other times it can look nuclear. Like just through and through, it'll look insane. Now personally speaking, if I had to pick one, my personal pick would be the Oppo, because I prefer natural colors just that much more, that not having the punchy, contrasted look of the Huawei is fine for me. Would I prefer higher contrast on the Oppo? Yes, and that's why I want to test out the other color profiles. But for now at least, for the sake of this particular comparison, I would say main camera night mode, my personal pick is the Oppo. Now then, ultra-wide cameras. So with the ultra-wide, as you can probably tell, it's not going to be all that high quality as the main camera, at least naturally. But one other thing that I've noticed is that the sharpening that we have on the Huawei, it can definitely be much more visible, much more obvious with the ultra-wide camera as opposed to with the main camera, where it kind of like blends in seamlessly and it doesn't feel as obvious or as awkward. So that is something to bear in mind. The Huawei's ultra-wide is not the best, especially because of the sharpening that it does. Not to mention, of course, the much more natural colors that we can get on the Oppo. That's definitely something I like. But then there are certain situations like this crazy backlit, just silhouetted shot of me. Well, it looks quite nice on the Huawei, better than what we have on the Oppo. Like the approach that it's taking, where it's got that contrast, it looks beautiful, it looks punchy, but it's not oversaturating weirdly enough, which I totally did not expect. I totally thought that it would just go crazy, but that's not the case, which is quite nice. So this is like one of my favorite shots from the Huawei thus far. And now of course, home stretch, zoom at night. So what really does happen when you try to use the telephoto cameras? I think this particular shot is very important, because you might want to get a shot like this of the horizon or the cityscape, and well, you just have to use your telephoto cameras for that very purpose, which is why, oddly enough, as opposed to all the zoom shots that we saw previously with the regular daylight shots, the Oppo is suffering tremendously. Honestly, I thought that this would not be the case. What I can guess is perhaps that Oppo is not even using the 3x. Somehow it's just defaulting to the main camera, which is why you just have what can be classified as a terrible image. Now, is this a one-time thing? Is it not? I'm not sure. But I can tell you it doesn't look good, especially compared to the Huawei. Now obviously, we have that hybrid optical zoom on the Huawei. It did not fare particularly well at daytime shots, but what about nighttime? Maybe having that optical zoom is what lets the Huawei excel at night mode zoom shots, like long range 10x zoom shots. And I think it most definitely does. Like, just look at the sheer difference in quality. That is insane. This is hard to believe that it's the same camera that gave us trashy results in regular daytime images. Like, how is it that we are getting astronomically better images at night, but somehow the shots that I took in regular daytime conditions or good lighting, those zoom shots just turned out nothing but garbage? Makes no sense to me, especially the telephoto zoom shots. I don't know what else to say. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and what I can tell you is this. When it comes to both of these phones, there's a ton of difference between these, but I do think that my personal pick, I'm not saying this for everyone, but my personal pick would be the Oppo, simply because of the natural colors. That is the overarching difference between the two, the colors. More so than the zoom, more so than the high resolution situation, it's the colors. If you like how Huawei looks, then that's going to be the one you pick, I'm sure. I like how the Oppo looks, and so that's the one I'm picking. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and well, I'll be seeing you guys soon with many more to come. Cheers.